Hello and welcome back to the Camera Rolling Podcast. This is episode 16 and I'm your host, Ronnie. Today we are talking about another potential neurodivergent / autistic character. Also, I have a playlist on YouTube where you can now view all of the episodes in which I talk about possibly neurodivergent characters in case you were wondering. So I thought because it is so close to the holiday season that this would be a great time to do sort of a more cozy episode. So today we're talking about Matilda. I love the movie Matilda because it's fun, it's pretty family friendly, and it's just like a great movie to like kind of cozy up to. But of course, like any of the episodes where I talk about possibly autistic characters, I have a few disclaimers. Number one, this video is not for diagnosis, so I'm not trying to diagnose Matilda, nor should you use it in trying to diagnose yourself. And number two, these videos are for fun. I know a lot of the times the comments get a little iffy, a little argumentative, and that is perfectly fine to express your opinion. But remember, we're here to have fun. We're just looking at a fictional character, so they are not a real person. It does not matter that much. We're just sort of diving in to how these characters have traits that also resemble the traits of autistic people. And I guess the last disclaimer is just that I'm autistic, so a lot of what I talk about in these videos is both based on my experience as an autistic person, but also just my research, because I think most people who are autistic do a fair bit of research into what autism is, and so we are fairly knowledgeable for the most part. But with that out of the way, let's jump into Matilda. Firstly, I wanted to give some background on Matilda because it is based off of a book written by Roald Dahl. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing Dahl's first name correctly, so I'm going to be calling him Dahl. Needless to say, he's a Norwegian children's literature writer as well as some other accolades. He also wrote classics like Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, James and the Giant Peach, and Fantastic Mr. Fox, which have all also been turned into films. When looking into Dahl, it's easy to see how a lot of his adventures as a kid sort of were the basis for a lot of his children's stories. Now, obviously, he wrote other things, but today we're specifically focusing on his children's stories and how they're related. But it seems throughout his childhood, he had a lot of fun playing pranks and essentially dissing authority. However, it seems like his opinion of authority and just those who generally hold power sort of shifted when he started at the Repton School in Derbyshire. Essentially, at this school, hazing and just general authority pretty much reigns supreme over everything. So when you look at his children's literature, you can see how a lot of the authority figures are very domineering. But it's also very clear in his work that a lot of these domineering figures meet awful fates. And I think this also highlights something that I find particularly interesting about Dahl himself, which is that he has a very clear sense of justice within his stories and seemingly, his own perspective on the world. It's very clear that fairness is important to him and comes through in a lot of his work. Many times the characters that are met with awful fates are the ones who essentially deserve it. They're the ones who are unfair or who are mean to others, etc. And this particularly interested me because a strong sense of justice is known to be one of the characteristics of autistic people. Especially when you couple that with like black and white thinking, meaning there are things that are more objectively wrong and things that are more objectively right. It's easy to see how like in his work it's very evident. And I do want to say that even though a lot of autistic people do have a very strong sense of justice, it does not necessarily mean that their justice is in the right place. Either way, I'd highly suggest looking into him and looking into more of his life because he actually lived a pretty crazy life beyond writing children's literature. Like, he did a lot of stuff. So, again, I would highly recommend researching him. But this is a film channel, so of course we're going to talk about the 1996 film Matilda. So if you're not familiar, Matilda is the story of a little girl who is born to a family that really doesn't like or care for her, even though she's extremely intelligent. And one day she discovers that she might actually have superpowers. Now, obviously, that's like a very vague description, but this movie, even though it does have a plot, it's not particularly plot driven. So there's a lot that happens in this movie, but it's all very like in lieu of just telling Matilda's story. So we open the movie with Danny DeVito himself narrating, although it's supposed to be implied that Danny DeVito is not also the Danny DeVito that we see in the movie, which is kind of weird. It's very clear from the opening scenes that her parents do not want her. They're not very good parents in the first place. They don't even strap her car seat into the car, and she goes just flying back and forth in the back seat or in the back wagon. And through these opening scenes, we discover that Matilda was extremely intelligent from day one. She was able to write her own name in a baby food before she could even speak, and yet her parents took no notice to this. And because they didn't really take notice of her personality, or just the things that she desired, she had to learn to fend for herself. Many times her mother, who's played by Rhea Perlman, which absolute gem of a woman, an actress. A lot of the times her mom would leave her with some random food like soup or fish sticks, whereas I don't think Matilda enjoyed those things. And something important to note before I begin describing some of the things that they talk about when she's younger is that autistic children often present just slightly different than in adulthood. Like, a lot of the times when people are late diagnosed autistic, it's very difficult for them to get a diagnosis in the first place because a lot of the autistic symptoms that they would otherwise be showing outwardly have been suppressed by like years and years of trying to conform to society's idea of how we're supposed to act. So a lot of the times people don't even notice these things. However, in autistic children, they're a little more prevalent. But even so, they oftentimes get overlooked because people think children are difficult, and so they chalk it up to a child being difficult and not a child having problems related to being autistic. So the first thing that stuck out to me when they were talking about her is they mentioned her specific sense of style. And when they mention it, it very much seems like what they mean is that she had a sense of style that was out of the norm, and when I look at her, she looks like a normal little girl. Like, she's not dressing in anything crazy, but it is very neat. Like, you'll notice how she has a very clear-cut bob and bangs, and like she has the ribbon in her hair. She also generally is wearing like socks that are like folded or like very neat, instead of just being like thrown on. But for the most part, I think a lot of kids probably wouldn't immediately pick those things to wear. And I think this is really important in terms of talking about autistic children, because I went through this as well, is that autistic people often have a particular sense of style that is mostly related to their sensory desires. So I am like very sensory oriented, and a lot of the times when I was a kid, I would get upset and have outbursts about the way that clothes fit me. It would be hard to find something for me to wear unless it touched me the right way or if it was the right fabric. And I think her sort of neat style is mostly related to her idea of sameness. She always wears the bow, and she has a very particular way that she likes to be dressed. They also mention as she's getting older that she likes to spend more time alone, and if you were a kid that grew up in a family that was not like you, they didn't have similar interests, or they just generally acted kind of different than you, then it would make sense that you would want to be alone. But most children don't like to be alone, and so the fact that she does enjoy being alone and doesn't really like being with her family sort of indicates to me that, a lot of the, excessive sensory stimuli that they sort of bring to the environment is very frustrating or makes it difficult for her to move about freely within the house. Eventually, we get to see that by the time Matilda is 4, she's able to read and she's read everything in the house, so she decides to go to the library where books live. And of course, because her family is gone for most of the day, if she wants to go to the library, she has to go by herself. I thought this was very interesting because they show how she has to look it up, how she has to walk 10 blocks, how she's crossing streets, being like within crowds and stuff. And I definitely think that, being autistic, at least for me, I'm hypersensitive to a lot of sensory stimuli. So that would be too hard for me as a child. But I also know that being autistic, sometimes your special interests will take precedent over like sensory overload. So if she truly desired to get to the library, she would take on the sensory awfulness that would be walking 10 blocks and crossing streets with loud people and everything like that. So I could see it either way. Some people would say, oh, well, she doesn't have any sensory issues, so she's not. Other people might say, well, you know, not everyone has the same sensory issues, so. And when Matilda gets to the library, she meets the librarian, and she's pretty much like, where can I find the children's books? And she goes to do that. And of course the librarian is like confused. She's like, why is this like little girl showing up? Like, no parents, no nothing. Like Matilda speaks very well and very clear and very directly throughout the entire movie. And so I imagine this librarian was like taken aback by this like little four-year-old girl who had like amazing diction. And as Matilda reads more and more, of course, she comes to the library more and more, and she makes friends with the librarian. And the librarian is telling her all about, you know, you can get a library card, you can come here, you can take books home instead of being here all day if you want to. Like, you can have access to so many more things. And this really stuck out to me because throughout this movie, even though she does have friends her age, she also has a lot of friends who are adults, and I think that's one of like the hallmarks of being an autistic child is like making friends with adults sort of before you make friends with other of your peers. Now obviously most of the time we encounter peers at a young age in schools or like at the playground, and her parents didn't take her to any of those places, so it makes sense that she wouldn't have any peers. But because of her interests, it drew her more to an adult figure. But we see Matilda get older. She's, I think, 6.5 now, and it seems like she desires to, you know, sort of branch out. At one point, she sees kids playing on the playground, and she desires to be in sort of that social situation. But when we see her next, she never approaches the children on the playground. She never actually asks to join them. She just goes and sits next to the playground and reads. And that to me is another big tell of autism, which is this desire to have social interactions but not actually have to interact with people, sort of like parallel play. That she desires to be near the social situation without having to engage in the actual social interaction that would come from that. And I find myself doing this all the time. Like, people watching is so like fun and interesting, and I like it feels social to me to be out in public and just sort of enjoy the company of like other people without having to interact with them. And I feel like a lot of other people or other autistic people can agree that that's like sort of comforting, and it very much does feel like a social interaction without actually interacting. But there comes an interaction one night between her and her father, Harry, where he's talking about her age, and he's saying, no, you are 4 years old, and she's like, no, I'm 6.5, I should be in school right now. And this is like one of the first real interactions that we get between her and her parents. And it's very easy to see that Matilda is being very straightforward. She's like, no, I'm 6.5. Like, I would know this. This is a fact. Where her parents are not really communicating in the way that makes sense to an autistic person. Like, if they are stating something that's very clearly not a fact, like, he wants her to be 4 so that she can stay at home. And in communicating that to her, he's saying, no, you are a liar because this is not what I want you to be. And I think that he's hoping that she will just be like, oh, you are an authority figure, I will take that as word, and I am now 4 years old, so I can stay home and watch the house. Whereas Matilda, being the autistic girl that she probably is, she says, no, that is not a fact. I am 6.5. I should be in school. I am not a liar. And so very much I have found that I have had encounters like this as an autistic person where I'm being accused of lying about something, and in reality I think that the other person was trying to communicate something differently, something sort of between the lines that I was not reading. And this happens frequently when we see her interact with her parents. At one point, her father comes home and he's telling their son, hey, this is how much I sold these cars for, this is how much I bought them for, how much did I make today? And he's saying all of these numbers, the son's trying to keep up, and Matilda, being the genius that she is like, oh, it's this number. And they all turn to her like, you couldn't have possibly done that. And I think in many ways, this was sort of a rhetorical question, or more so a question that was only posed to the son, so he was the only one who's supposed to answer, but Matilda does not pick up on that, and she just says the answer because a question was in fact posed. And of course, this makes her father extremely angry, and she has no idea why, because a question was posed and she did answer it. And being the literal thinker that many autistic people are, when he says that bad people must be punished, she takes that literally. And her dad was being a bad person. He was being mean. And so she decides to punish him, using a little, sort of loophole in his speaking. This is when we get a fun little sequence of Matilda finally, taking some of the power back. She does sort of a prank style sort of revenge where she replaces her father's hair oil with peroxide so it lightens his hair. We also find out that this is the day the kids are coming along with him to work. He's a used car salesman, but he very much runs a chop shop and just he's a liar and a cheat, to say the least. So when he's showing the kids the ropes, he's saying, okay, well, we're supposed to weld this on here, this bumper, we're gonna glue it. Matilda realizes that this is a scam, that he's a liar, that he's a cheater, and she calls him out and he says, it doesn't matter, you're a child, who cares what you think, I'm gonna do what I do. And Matilda says, he's still being a bad person, so she glues his hat to his head. And to further exacerbate the situation, at home they are having dinner around the TV like they always do, and Matilda sort of decides to, join in on this activity where she's sitting there and she's reading, and this infuriates her father. He says, are you, a part of this family? Why are you reading? This is garbage. You have to be a part of this family, which means you have to do what we do. And of course, Matilda's like, well, I'm reading something very lovely. This is called Moby Dick. It's very interesting. And again, we're having this interaction where very much, if you were an autistic child, you probably had this interaction multiple times in your life where you are just saying what you feel is true, saying your true thoughts and feelings, and the adult who is trying to communicate with you is asking you to read between lines that you do not see, and they get infuriated and they get angry at you because you are not picking up what they are putting down. And thus you are punished for things that do not seem objectively wrong. So her father rips up the book and forces her to watch the TV, and this is when we get our little glimpse into her powers, and she makes the TV explode with her mind. The next day, Matilda finally gets her wish, and her father tells her that she's going to get to go to school, but this is because he met a woman at his job who is a principal, and she seemed like a very mean woman, focused on discipline, and that is what Harry believes is wrong with Matilda, that she doesn't have discipline. So he decides to send her to that school. Matilda's obviously very excited because she's finally getting to go to school for the first time because she loves learning. However, she finds out very quickly that the principal, Miss Trunchbull, is a terrible and horrifying person. The things that she does is just straight up child abuse. You would never be able to do that to a child, and obviously this movie is dramatic and it's not real, but this lady has some issues, some deep-rooted issues regarding her anger, regarding children. Miss Girl needs to go to therapy. But Matilda meets a wonderful little girl named Lavender. She is so cute. She is seriously, all the children in this movie are just absolutely adorable, but I love Lavender. Her little voice and those big old glasses, how sweet is she? Anyway, she meets Lavender, they sort of become friends, Lavender's showing her around, and this is also when she gets to meet Miss Honey, her teacher. And of course, Miss Honey is like the epitome of inspiration for the cottagecore girlies. But in Miss Honey's class, they're going over math, and Matilda's sort of sitting in, and she gets to show how advanced she is in front of the class. Not really meaning to. Again, Miss Honey sort of poses a question, and it's like a rhetorical type of question, and Matilda answers and wows everyone. But this is also where they immediately connect, and Matilda talks about how much she loves learning and she loves Charles Dickens, and Miss Honey immediately sort of like sees herself in this little girl, that she has so much potential and that she's, very much going to be an amazing person. After school, Matilda gets home, and when she gets home, something happens that's like, literally, it's so little, but again, it's just so indicative of the autistic experience, which is that her mom is sitting on the phone and she asks, like, how was your day at school? And Matilda says, oh, it was great, it was amazing, and she's about to go on saying the things that she thought was amazing about school, and her mom is like, shush, stop talking, I'm on the phone. And Matilda's like, you asked how I was, you asked about my day, why am I not supposed to answer? And I have encountered this so many times where there's really no good in between as an autistic person when we are posed the question like, hi, how are you? I absolutely hate small talk. Most of the time I don't answer it. And I say this because most of the time people really dislike the answers that autistic people give, which is either like we answer it very shortly, like, oh, okay, like, I'm okay, when someone is expecting more, or we answer it with more and we talk about our day and we talk about what's going on in our life, and they actually did not want to hear it. I very much do not like small talk because I don't understand the purpose of it if it's not functioning as a way to actually meaningfully communicate with someone or to communicate general information.
When she was having that.
Mom, I'm home.
Oh, how was school? The thing with Valerie's
School was
brother.
great. My teacher lets me do
No.
6th grade work.
You're
Look,
kidding.
algebra
I love
and
that
geography.
Hold on a minute. Can't you see I'm in the middle of an important phone call?
Well, you just asked me how school was.
Quiet.
Anyway, that evening, Miss Honey shows up to Matilda's house wanting to talk to her parents about how intelligent she is and how she should be doing, more advanced work. However, this is when Miss Honey witnesses firsthand that her parents do not care about her, they do not like her, and that they really just don't value education. I didn't want to skip over this part because it is iconic, but it doesn't really have anything to do with my talking about autism, which is that, like, essentially the next time we see them in school, it's the iconic scene of the kid eating the entire cake in front of the school. Nothing to do with autism, just thought I'd mention it. However, the next time we see Matilda, it's with her and her friends before school, and they're just hanging out in the wilderness, looking at like cool animals and insects, and they end up finding a newt, so they take it to class, and unfortunately, Matilda gets snatched by Miss Trunchbull before she can get to class. Miss Trunchbull is upset with Matilda because her dad sold her a faulty car, and so Matilda must pay, and she goes into the chokey, which is like this closet that has like a lot of like really dangerous stuff. Like, it looks like it's from a Saw movie or something, like, but quickly Miss Honey realizes, that her star pupil is missing, so Lavender indicates to her like, hey, she's in the chokey, and so Miss Honey sneaks out to get Matilda out, and in class, Miss Trunchbull is met with the newt. She is afraid of animals for the most part, and so when the newt ends up in her glass, she freaks out. And even more so, when Matilda uses her mind powers, she ends up making the newt get on Miss Trunchbull, and she just starts, she's upset, angry. But in looking at this scene, it's very easy to see how, like, again, Matilda, it seems like she's not scared enough of Miss Trunchbull, because most people know that when someone of authority makes a mistake, like calling a newt a snake, you don't correct them. But Matilda does it anyway because she wants people to know the information, you know, like any autistic person would be like, actually that's a newt, it's not a snake, like I don't want you to walk around having misinformation, right? But of course Miss Trunchbull takes that as a slight. And again, I think most people know that. They just instinctively know that you don't do that. But autistic people, genuinely, we do not most of the time. We have to learn over time that you don't correct authority figures.
Well, I'll pay you back, young lady.
For what, Miss Trunchbull?
For this newt, you pissworm!
I'm telling you, I didn't do it.
Besides, even if you didn't do it, I'm gonna punish you. Because I'm big and you're small, and I'm right and you're wrong, and there's nothing you can do about it.
However, after Miss Trunchbull leaves, Matilda decides to confide in Miss Honey that she has superpowers. She can move stuff with her mind. And Miss Honey's like, I'm sure you do. And even though Matilda is disappointed that she isn't able to show Miss Honey her superpowers, Miss Honey's like, hey, why don't you come after school and we'll have some tea and cookies and just like hang out for a little bit. And of course Matilda's like up for that because who would want to go home? This is when we get to see where Miss Trunchbull lives, as well as Miss Honey sort of tells the story behind Miss Trunchbull's house, that there was actually somebody else who lived there, her niece, and that this little girl ended up running away and Miss Trunchbull kept the house. And of course when they get to like Miss Honey's house, Matilda puts it together and realizes that Miss Honey is actually Trunchbull's niece. And of course this story strikes Matilda very close to home because she is also dealing with sort of like abusive or I guess neglectful family, which is also sort of a type of abuse, but she's also dealing with a very sort of hostile situation as the little girl was, and like she realizes that, you know, that was Miss Honey, and it just, you know, sort of makes her feel like, you know, will things ever get better? And Miss Honey like assures her like, no, things are gonna get better. I know that you don't fit in with your family, and you know, I didn't fit in with my family, so you see me now, I'm happy, I'm living in a cool cottage, I teach at school, like. But over tea, Miss Honey explains to Matilda sort of just all of the things that she had to leave behind when she ran away from the Trunchbull house over there. And Matilda, of course, having her sense of fairness and justice, is like, well, those are your belongings, shouldn't we get them back? And this sort of prompts Matilda to want to get those things back for Miss Honey. And they watch as Miss Trunchbull leaves her house, and Matilda just runs into the house being like, then let's go get it right now, she's gone. But as they're in the house, even though Miss Honey has a lot of time to explain, like, I wanted this is what I had to leave behind, etc., Miss Trunchbull comes back. But Matilda and Miss Honey are able to sneak out before Miss Trunchbull actually finds them. She just knows that, like, somebody was in her house. And of course Matilda is still sitting there like, we gotta go back at some point and get those things back, like those are your things. And Miss Honey's like, promise me you will never go into that house. And Matilda, being the black and white thinker that she is like, I smell a loophole because I have telekinetic powers, so I don't have to go in the house to get the stuff back. So that's what I'm gonna do. However, Matilda doesn't really know how to control her powers yet, and so this is also when we get the iconic scene of her, like, finally harnessing those powers, moving stuff in the house and dancing around, and it's just a fun time. After Matilda sort of learns how to harness her powers, she's able to go back to Miss Trunchbull's house in the middle of the night and grab those things, but she ends up leaving her bow behind, which Miss Trunchbull almost immediately recognizes. So at school, Miss Trunchbull tries to take this sort of revenge on Matilda. However, she ends up being unsuccessful as Matilda uses her powers yet again to scare her and harass her, and this is essentially when she gets revenge for all of the kids who have been harassed in the past. She just harasses her until she runs out of school forever. And this is when we get sort of to like the last 10 minutes of the film where everything's wrapping up. So Miss Honey was able to get her house back from Miss Trunchbull, as well as now Matilda has a nice safe environment to hang out, to info dump. I think consistently throughout the movie you see how she just sort of like will talk about random facts or just like things that she knows that are even like kind of relevant to the situation. But we see as Matilda is at Miss Honey's house one day that her parents pull up. They are hectic and they say that they are moving to Guam right now. However, Matilda is not ready to like leave Miss Honey. Like, she's the only person she really has as a friend that she likes around here. And so Matilda pulls out of her bag adoption papers that she has had since like day one. And I'm not gonna lie, the moment between her and her mom where she pretty much is like, you're my only daughter, but I never understood you. Like, she pretty much was like, I love you, but I get it. You're better off here. And I'm like, I don't know. That's just so crazy to think, like, that she was so okay with giving up her child, like, for adoption, but also, like, it needed to happen and she recognized that. Like, I don't know. The one time they decide to be good parents. So they sign the papers, they go off to Guam, and Matilda gets to live happily with her new mom, Miss Honey.
You're the only daughter I ever had, Matilda. And I never understood you, not one little bit. Who's got a pen?
And as the movie wraps up with Matilda and Miss Honey just enjoying each other's presence now that they get to be like mother and daughter, it makes me feel like Miss Honey may also be neurodivergent, mostly because of just how they portray their new relationship. Because they very much do not portray them as mother and daughter in the scenes that we see of them, like hula hooping and picnicking and reading together. Like, yes, we do get sort of the mother-daughter moment of her tucking her in for bed and reading the story, but very much it seems like they enjoy a lot of the same activities. They enjoy learning and they enjoy sewing, things like that. And I feel like that's very indicative of the way that like a lot of neurodivergent relationships are. More so that I think neurodivergent adults often connect very well with their children through similar activities because of the way that neurodivergent brains are sort of made. So although it's not canon that Matilda is autistic, I think because so many neurodivergent children can relate to Matilda, especially children who like don't have any neurodivergent family members, it's easy to see why the autistic community would welcome her as like an autistic character. Doll didn't specify that she was autistic, and we don't know that like he wasn't autistic. We can't say for sure that like that was the intention of the character, but I think it still gets through on a really good note. Still, it's just like an amazing and heartwarming movie about feeling out of place and misunderstood as a child. I think part of Doll's intention is that it's about believing in oneself enough to stand true to who we are, because eventually we will find our place in the world. And I think autistic children especially can identify with that desire and finding a neurodivergent community where they can exist comfortably. Also, while I was doing just like a little bit of research for Matilda, I found this amazing FYI article by Kelsey O'Malley about how Matilda is autistic coded and sort of how her experience as an early diagnosed autistic person is quite similar to Matilda's. I'll link it if you want to read it as well. But I definitely think hearing the perspective as someone who was diagnosed when they were younger and not when they were an adult is especially important in a scenario like this. But I really think that that's all that I have to say about Matilda. You'll have to let me know what you think. But with that said, keep watching movies, and I'll see you in the next episode.